Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize. He deserved it. The work on trade patterns and economic geography from the late 1970s through the early 1990s is technically serious, mathematically careful, and genuinely changed how economists think about where industries locate and why countries trade with each other. That work earned the prize, and the prize was fair. That work is also almost entirely irrelevant to what Paul Krugman has been doing for the last 25 years. Because what Krugman has been doing for 25 years is something quite different. He has been converting the borrowed authority of that Nobel Prize into a license to practice a very specific kind of intellectual operation, one that presents itself as rigorous economics, functions as partisan commentary, and defends itself against all criticism by preemptively classifying critics as either stupid or corrupt. And the problem isn't that he's wrong about everything, he isn't. The problem is that he has constructed a way of being wrong that looks, from the outside, almost identical to being right. Let's start with the method, because the method is the message. Krugman's central rhetorical move, the one that runs through his columns, his books, his blog, is what we might call the epistemological monopoly. The claim, stated explicitly and repeatedly, is that in the major macroeconomic debates since 2008, there is a side that follows the evidence and a side that follows ideology. And Krugman is always, without exception, on the evidence side. Now, this might be true. In principle, one economist could be reliably right while all his opponents are reliably wrong. It's possible. But notice what this claim actually requires. It requires that Krugman's prior commitments, his ISLM model, his Keynesian framework, his fiscal multiplier estimates, are themselves neutral and validated rather than being one contested methodological position among several. It requires that the uncertainty which is constitutive of macroeconomics somehow evaporates in his hands. It requires, in short, that the model is not a model but a kind of mirror of reality. And here's where it gets interesting. The ISLM model, the two-curve framework that forms the analytical skeleton of almost everything Krugman argues about recessions and policy, was explicitly disowned by the economist who invented it. John Hicks in 1980 published a paper called ISLM, an explanation in which he described the model as a classroom gadget that was never meant to represent dynamic processes, that had no adequate treatment of time and expectations, and that he himself had come to regard as more misleading than illuminating. The inventor of the model retired it. Krugman kept using it. Why? Because ISLM is extraordinarily good at generating clean, legible policy recommendations. It tells you that in a demand-constrained economy, fiscal expansion shifts the IS curve right, output rises, and you're done. It produces conclusions with the satisfying determinism of a physics equation. The problem, the deep problem, is that it buys this clarity by eliminating almost everything that makes economic crises actually dangerous. Debt dynamics, financial intermediation, heterogeneous balance sheets, the endogenous generation of instability. The 2008 crisis was not primarily a problem of consumer demand falling short of some stable equilibrium. It was a systemic implosion of a leverage structure that had been building for decades, in which financial actors had created an architecture of mutual exposure so complex that no one fully understood it. Treating that crisis as a demand management problem is like treating a building fire as primarily an air quality issue. Technically, yes, there is a connection. The emphasis, however, is catastrophically misplaced. Now let's talk about an example. Because Krugman's examples are a masterclass in the art of the misleading illustration. His favorite example of how recessions work, the one he returns to again and again across 20 years of writing, is the Capitol Hill babysitting co-op. You've probably heard it. A cooperative of Washington, D.C. parents issued vouchers for babysitting. Parents started hoarding vouchers. Nobody was hiring babysitters. The cooperative was in recession. The solution was to issue more vouchers. Krugman presents this as a simple model of aggregate demand failure. And it is. It is perfectly, beautifully simple. Which is precisely the problem. The co-op has no banks, no debt, no production, no international linkages, no heterogeneous agents, no mechanism by which its stability could breed instability over time. It is a closed system with one good and one unit of account. It is the most pristine possible coordination failure, scrubbed clean of every complicating feature of an actual economy. Using this example to explain the 2008 financial crisis is not an illustration. It is a substitution. Krugman has not shown you what the real economy looks like through a simplified lens. He has shown you a completely different system that happens to rhyme with one feature of the real economy, while eliminating every feature that would make his policy recommendations contestable. And then there's the matter of how Krugman handles disagreement. When economists challenged his multiplier estimates, when Chicago economists like Cochrane and Lucas argued that fiscal stimulus in a globally integrated economy with forward-looking agents would be largely offset, Krugman did not simply dispute their empirical claims or their modeling assumptions. He attributed their positions to class interest, Davos socialization, and psychological resentment of simple solutions. He described them as people who had built their careers on beautiful mathematics and couldn't admit that the answer might be boring and Keynesian. Now, this might be partially true of some people. What it cannot be is evidence. Krugman does not demonstrate this motivation. He asserts it. He turns it into a standing explanation that immunizes his own position against challenge, because now any objection can be reclassified as further evidence of motivated reasoning on the part of the objector. He has built an epistemological structure that is, functionally, unfalsifiable. And here is the deepest irony. Krugman correctly and repeatedly castigates economists who cling to their models in the face of contradictory evidence. He wrote devastatingly about economists who couldn't abandon efficient markets hypothesis after 2008 showed its limits. His critique of other economists' model addiction is among his best work. He has never applied this critique to himself. When David Autor and his colleagues published the China Shock Research, showing that manufacturing trade liberalization had created devastation in specific regional labor markets that was far more severe and far more permanent than standard trade models predicted, Krugman acknowledged the findings. He said he had missed the distributional effects. He moved on. What he did not do was ask why he had missed them. What he did not do was ask what it meant that his framework had been structurally incapable of generating those predictions in advance, not because of bad data or bad luck, but because the model itself was not built to see regional feedback loops, social capital erosion, or the interaction between economic displacement and political radicalization. He treated a systemic limitation of his analytical apparatus as a factual oversight, correctable by adding a redistribution recommendation as an appendix. The forest was burning and he updated the weather forecast. Here is what Paul Krugman is. A technically accomplished economist who has spent 25 years making himself progressively less useful as an intellectual and progressively more effective as a political actor, and who has never fully acknowledged that these are in tension. The problem is not that he's a liberal. The problem is that he has operationalized liberalism as a claim about what science requires, and has done so in a way that makes his positions unfalsifiable, his opponents pathological, and the genuine uncertainty of macroeconomics invisible. What gets lost when this happens? What gets lost is the actual difficulty. The real complexity of why economies fail, why inequality compounds, why trade disrupts communities in ways that models don't predict. All of this gets flattened into a morality play in which the evidence is clear. The answer is Keynesian stimulus and progressive redistribution. And anyone who disagrees is either making excuses for the rich or suffering from motivated reasoning. Krugman is most dangerous not when he's wrong but when he's right by accident, when his policy conclusions happen to be broadly correct but his reasoning forecloses the deeper questions that would tell you when those conclusions stop being correct. You cannot get that from a man who has decided in advance that he already knows which side of every debate the evidence is on. The Nobel Prize was for work done before he stopped being uncertain. The work done after the work he's actually famous for is the work of a man who found certainty more useful than rigor, and who has been, ever since, defending that trade. That trade has a cost. And the bill, unlike his stimulus programs, does not come with a Keynesian multiplier.